Hey, welcome to the webinar today. I'm joined here by Marc Borstein, and we're going to be looking at ephemeral clusters. How are you doing today, Marc? Go ahead and
Good.
run over to you.
Yep. No, looking forward to getting going.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll drop off for the presentation, and then you said there's going to be a demo. I'll hop back on, and we can talk through the demo and stuff if you'd like.
Fantastic. So thanks everybody for joining me. My name is Marc Borstein. I'm the CTO of Tremble Security. And like Mike said, we're going to be talking about ephemeral clusters. There we go. So real quick, who am I? I'm the CTO of Tremble Security. Been doing identity management for 20 plus years in both the commercial and US federal agency spaces. I've been working with Kubernetes since 2015, primarily when OpenID Connect and RBAC came in. So I think that was 1.3. If you have ever asked questions in the Kubernetes Slack about authentication or RBAC or authorization, pretty good conversation, we've talked. I am the co-author of Kubernetes and Enterprise Guide, 2nd edition, and also the co-author of Kubernetes Enterprise Guide, 3rd edition, which is going to be coming out early next year, Q1 or Q2 next year. Includes a brand new chapter on vCluster. It's a lot of fun to have written. And I've been working with vCluster for a year or two now. And we're going to be talking about some of the fun stuff we've done here around ephemeral clusters and reusable infrastructure. So first we're going to talk about why you might have an ephemeral cluster, get into what that looks like, the different APIs involved, your parts list. We'll step through the workflow, and then we're going to go through a demo of building up the ephemeral cluster, tearing it down, and then rebuilding it again from scratch. All right, so why an ephemeral cluster? I'm a big fan of stories. I like reading my kids' stories, so I'm going to start us off with a little bedtime story. Probably a very common occurrence. You've spent the week building up a cluster for some application or implementation. You've got your monitoring in place. Hopefully it's Git enabled. You've got a secrets manager in there. Everything's running beautifully. It's Friday night. You've got your feet up, maybe enjoying a cold beverage, and the doorbell rings. And it's this guy. This is David Flanagan, aka Raw Code, the host of the Cluster D YouTube channel, where David gets really smart people who really know Kubernetes well to break each other's clusters and fix them in new, interesting, and quite frankly, horrifying ways. And so he comes in, he says, "Hey, I got a couple of beers. You know, you want to hang out and show me what you've done? I love learning about new things." You're like, "Yeah, I'm gonna show you what I'm doing." And you all start poking around the cluster, and the next thing you know, everything is on fire. Kubernetes clusters are relatively easy to deploy. They can be really hard to debug. There's a reason why Kubernetes the hard way exists. Today we've kind of gotten used to this idea that we're going to log into, Amazon, Azure, VMware, whatever, and say, okay, give me a cluster, right? But the fact is that all the automation that goes in behind the scenes of that is really complicated and can break real easy. And there's a big gap in the skill set between someone who's really good at putting together manifests and deploying applications into Kubernetes versus someone who's really good at fixing a broken cluster. And so one of the benefits of an ephemeral cluster, a cluster where you're not storing any of the data inside of Kubernetes, or at least that's not the authoritative place for it, is that if everything's gone wrong, you can say, we're going to time box this. We're only going to spend X amount of time on this, and then we're just going to start over. And so that's a really powerful way to be able to approach multi-tenancy as well, because to do that, you need to be able to automate that rebuilding. If step one of building is a cluster is kubeadm, that's not really a good way to do something that's ephemeral. So now that we've kind of talked about what that use case is, why you might want to use an ephemeral cluster, let's dive into how you actually do that. So at its core, Kubernetes is an API and a database. That database is generally etcd. It doesn't have to be. So for instance, K3s can use a database, a relational database like MySQL. And so the question becomes, is the data in that database authoritative? Is it, or is it a replica of something else? So when you have that conversation, you'll actually often land on GitOps, right? We want to store our manifests, the thing that represents our infrastructure, inside of some kind of Git repository. Now, there might be an intermediary step where, you've got something that generates something that goes in, but, like a Helm chart, right? But at the end of the day, you want your manifests, your declaration of infrastructure to be outside of your cluster. So we're already starting to see the building blocks of the Ephemeral cluster. If my manifests are not stored in my cluster, that means the database isn't super important. I can rebuild that from scratch. But you don't want to store everything in Git. You don't want to store your secrets in Git. And there are some really important reasons why you don't want to store secrets in Git. First off, you want to track secrets. You want to know who's using a secret. Kelsey Hightower did a demo of Vault's integration with Kubernetes for the SIGAuth community, and he talked about how it's not really super important, or it's not really super beneficial that Vault is locking down access to the secret. What the benefit is it's helping you track that secret. It's helping you know who's using it, and when it's being used and why it's being used. And so that's really important. The problem when you store a secret in Git, even if it's encrypted, is Git is specifically designed to be easily forkable. It's incredibly easy to take a internal repository and accidentally push it up to public GitHub. It's really not that hard to do. And once you've done that, you've now lost control of it. So even though the keys might be encrypted, or the secrets might be encrypted, you've now lost control of who has it. Additionally, updating those encrypted secrets in Git can be really painful. You've got to go through them. You got to make sure they're updated, pushed, synced in. So it's two things that are really not meant to work together. Don't put your secrets in Git, even if they're encrypted. So you want to have some kind of secrets manager. So once you've done that, you've put all your secrets in a secrets manager. You've put all of your manifests, whether that's a Helm chart or it's code for building out your objects, inside of Git. You have now created the foundation of a ephemeral cluster. So now the question is, how are you going to implement these things? What are you going to use as the basis for this stuff? So no surprise, we're going to use vCluster for our Kubernetes implementation. The value here of vCluster is it makes it super easy. It's API enabled to be able to get from nothing to a K3s cluster that's up and running very quickly. The reason why I like a K3s cluster for this, you can use a relational database, very easy to automate. There's all kinds of different ways that you can automate a database's management, backups, things like that, whether you run it on cluster or not. So, being able to stand up a K3s instance, tear it down and stand it back up again, that's something that vCluster does really, really well. We're going to use Vault for secrets. It's API enabled, very popular with enterprise customers, but pick your cloud secret manager, pick your implementation secret manager. VMware just came out with the secret management system. So anything that's API enabled will work really well in this scenario. And finally, we're going to go with GitHub. Again, it's got an API, but there's no reason why you couldn't do this with GitLab, Gitea, pick your favorite Git implementation. So we've got our foundation. We've got where we're going to store our data. We've got the APIs available. But the next thing we need to do is figure out how we're going to get our manifests that are stored in GitHub into our vCluster. Enter Argo CD. I like Argo CD. It's my favorite GitOps controller. I come from an enterprise world. I come from a world where GUIs are great. I love GUIs. I will not be shamed into not using my GUIs. It's a great way to show a lot of information, a lot of complex information at once. And so I really like using Argo CD for this to be able to sync our manifests into our vCluster. So we have our GitOps controller, we have our data. The next question is, how are users going to authenticate? Like, how are you going to actually get into your vCluster? we're going to use Okta. You know, could be Azure AD, could be Active Directory, could be GitHub, anything else. I come from primarily an enterprise world. Okta, Azure AD are kind of two of the big ones outside of Active Directory. So we're going to use Okta. So once the cluster gets launched, users are going to have to log in using their Okta account, and we want to have Okta with a group that manages that access. But because Argo CD also has a GUI, we want to make sure that Argo also, you're logging in via Okta. So then the question becomes, how do we pull all this together? I mean, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 6 distinct APIs here to be able to build out this infrastructure. So you need something to kind of bring that together. So this is where Tremolo Security comes in with the Open Unison project. So if y'all have heard of Open Unison before, it's probably going to be in the context of authentication for Kubernetes clusters. You know, being able to say proxy your authentication from Okta or Azure AD into your cluster. The other thing Open Unison has is a namespace as a service system, so where a user can log in and say, hey, please give me this namespace. You know, here's why I need it, and it'll provision it. So we're going to piggyback off of that to automate all this infrastructure. Now you might think it's a little weird. Why is an identity management tool my infrastructure provisioning tool? Well, we've got 6 different APIs. Each one of them has a different way of managing identity. Right? Vault has its token system. vCluster piggybacks off of Kubernetes. Okta has its own API. GitHub has GitHub apps. MySQL has its own identity system. So you not just need something that knows how to talk to these different APIs, but how to do it securely. So let's go back through our parts list in a little more detailed way. So for Kubernetes, we're going to use vCluster to launch our clusters. We're going to use K3s as our actual cluster implementation. I really like K3s as a virtual cluster because you can use a relational database. Relational databases are generally much easier to administer large numbers of versus etcd databases. We'll use Git for our host manifest. We're going to use GitHub, like I said. It's up there. It's an API, something else I didn't have to deploy. Secrets management, we're going to use HashiCorp Vault, and we're going to use it in a multi-tenant fashion. So now we're not going to dive into how to configure a multi-tenant vault. That's that's another show. But we are going to show how each vCluster is going to be registered in Vault so that it can securely communicate with Vault to retrieve secrets out of Vault for workloads in that vCluster. For Argo CD, we're going to use Argo CD for GitOps, Okta for authentication, tie everything together with Open Unison. So we've talked about the what, we've talked about the why. Now let's talk about the how. So here's the workflow of what needs to happen to onboard a new tenant. Our host cluster is already running a cert manager, and it's also hosting our MySQL instance. So the first thing that's going to happen is as a user, I'm going to register into Open Unison and say, hey, please give me a tenant. I'm going to say the name of the tenant, why I need it, and what the groups in Okta are going to be. That will then provision the tenant and role bindings to the admin cluster role for that namespace for any member of those groups. So that gives me kube control access into that particular namespace. Then I'm going to go over to number 2. I'm going to provision a certificate using the Kubernetes API that Cert Manager will then provision so that vCluster has a secure way to communicate with MySQL. Then I'll come over here to MySQL, provision a database and a user that's authorized to manage that database that's bound to that key. Then we get to the fun part. We deploy a vCluster. Because it's deployed inside the namespace, everything's centered there. We'll provision that vCluster. That will communicate with MySQL. That'll be its backend database. Next, we're going to provision an Open Unison into that vCluster. So if you think about it, each individual vCluster needs to be able to authenticate with Okta. You don't want that vCluster to have to host a client secret up to Okta. A lot of enterprises are siloed. The people who own Kubernetes don't own identity. They don't own Okta. And so if you need to make API calls to Okta every single time you want to onboard a new tenant, you could get some pushback from the identity team because they've got their own compliance issues they've got to be mindful of. So in this model, each vCluster gets an open unison that is trusting the control plane's open unison. So the vCluster doesn't need to trust Okta directly. Excuse me. The vCluster doesn't have to trust Okta directly. It can trust the control plane, which then trusts Okta. The nice thing about that is once we deploy Argo CD, now any cluster management applications that the tenant wants to use can now tie in directly to their own open unison. They don't have to tie in to Okta or the control plane. So we deploy open unison and we tie that together with the control plane. So that way we now have authentication into our virtual cluster. We also go ahead and deploy the Kubernetes dashboard. I said I like Mike at least. So once that's deployed, next we come down here and we got to talk to Vault. So we got to onboard an authentication mechanism into Vault so that tokens generated by our vCluster can authenticate to Vault. So that way, the pod dies, that token is no longer valid. That's going to be a big boon for security. You don't want to have long-lived tokens. We're also going to onboard a policy that says any token in a given namespace can read secrets for that namespace. So if I've got multiple namespaces are the boundary for security inside of Kubernetes. Makes sense to make that line up with Vault as well. In theory, you could have it a little tighter if you wanted to, but this is the easiest way to automate that. Coming into the home stretch, we've automated our Vault implementation. Now we're going to go ahead and deploy Argo CD into our tenant cluster. Argo CD gets deployed, a SSO trust is established with Open Unison, so that way you can SSO into Argo using your Okta credentials, and we set up the group mappings. So that way, if you're a member of the right group, you have administrative privileges inside of Argo. And last but not least, doesn't really make sense to have a GitOps without Git. So now we need to provision, now we need to provision a Git repo and establish a trust using a deployment key. Once all that is done, we are now able to run workloads on our virtual cluster. So let's build a virtual cluster. All right, so let's start out with what we have. So we have this empty GitHub repo, right? There's nothing in there. This is where our Git repo is going to go that stores our manifests. We have a Vault implementation. This Vault implementation has a Kubernetes authentication method to our host cluster, but not to our tenants yet. We also have a policy that lets us administer, excuse me, sorry everybody, I'm getting over a cold. That lets us administer the vCluster. We also have a secret store in here where you'll see that this is called tenant 1, default namespace, and we've got this secret called config. Our workload is going to pull this secret in. That's where our final workload is going to do. So that's our Vault implementation. And we have a, go ahead and log back in. So this is the Kubernetes dashboard for our host cluster. So we're going to watch the bouncing ball from here. Excuse me. And then finally, this is Open Unison. So if you've ever used Open Unison to log into a cluster, this looks a little bit different. One, it's our new interface that's coming out. But two, there are some new badges here. Usually you see these badges for the dashboard and tokens, but there's also this, let's create a new namespace badge. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new namespace. We're going to call it tenant one. And right now I'm pulling in the groups from Okta. So we've got two groups created inside of Open Unison to be able to manage access. Now, we could also have what I call an internal group, where if we need to be able to provide access to someone outside of our central identity store, we can do that. I wanted to keep this a little bit simple. So demo. So I've submitted the request. Now I'm also an administrative user, so I can approve the request. So I'm going to approve, and we're off. So the first thing we're going to notice is if we go to our jobs, or if we go to rather our cluster, is we now have a new tenant. That new namespace, that was the first thing that got created. If we look at pods, we can see that the vCluster is starting to launch. We're going to come over here to the Open Unison namespace, where we can see that we've got the onboard vCluster. If we look at the logs, it's not terribly exciting, but what's happening is we've launched a job that is launching our vCluster and integrating it with MySQL. So this is going to take a few minutes. So I don't know, are there any questions so far I can answer?
I don't see any yet, but one of my questions that I have is, so like, what's the average stage that most people you talk to are at when they're thinking about security? So like, how far into their journey of deployment do they finally say, hey, I need to think about this differently and maybe use vCluster or some of the setup? Like, have they deployed multiple clusters? Have they have 20 clusters and they come to you and they're like, this is too expensive?
I wish I could say that it was earlier in the process. Unfortunately, it's usually 15 minutes before they go live. It's a great question. I'm a big believer in security early, but usually once people have felt the pain, that's when they're like, okay, I've done this the hard way. Can we do this the easy way now? Pause that idea for a second. So we've launched the vCluster. Our vCluster is now up and running. So let's go take a look at tenant one. And we can see we've got our, got a little bit more now too, but we've got our core DNS. Like, that's how you know vCluster is up and running. Core DNS is there. You're now ready to get started. And then if we go back to Open Unison in our host cluster, like we haven't left Open Unison yet, we'll see that we are now running the integration of Open Unison and vCluster. So what this is doing is, if you've ever deployed Open Unison, you do OU control install off portal. This is install satellite. So this is running that Helm chart, very similar to vCluster, where we embedded the Helm commands directly into a larger command to make it a little easier to deploy. And this will continue to run for a minute as well. These are the two slowest parts, are running the vCluster and Open Unison install. So back to your question, Mike, it's more common that after there's been a lot of pain, people realize, well, wait a second, I think there's probably an easier way to do this, because I'll be honest, a lot of the marketing is really focused on multi-cluster, like giving everybody their own cluster. And one of the reasons I think that is because being able to do a good multi-tenant system in Kubernetes requires so many different components. That's hard to market. That's hard to explain quickly. I mean, geez, we've been talking for 20 minutes and we didn't get to the demo until then. By the way, OpenUS is done deploying. So the next thing that's going on is Vault, or is Vault already done? Vault might already be done. Let's see here. If we go to access, nope, not yet. Policies. Nope, not yet. This is running, right?
So we did get a question too from LinkedIn. So does the vCluster get its own ingress controller, or does it need to be integrated in some way to the parent cluster's ingress? For example, if I was running Nginx.
So great question. So the vClusters do not get their own ingress controller. We're using the built-in syncer into, we're using the built-in syncer to now propagate that into the ingress from your vCluster into the host cluster. Did this, what's going on here?
Sorry, look at that. So like the end user would just create like an ingress resource, and then that would get synced to the host cluster. So they just need to know like a little bit of information about like which ingress you're using.
Right. So that got created. Did I forget to make a sacrifice to the gods of live demos? Why is this tenant 1 pods? So we've got Open Unison. Why isn't it deploying Argo? Oh, here we go. Interesting. Okay, let's see if we can fix this. Give me one moment. So that's how you know I'm not just doing a recording, right, folks? .vCluster management admin console queues dead letter queue. All right, let's try this again. Oops. Cluster control plane. Let's go ahead and move this in there. Task Kate's vCluster tenant 1 does not exist. All right, let's try this again. Why didn't the target get created? All right, I think if I do this, it'll just restart. So it looks like we just had a timing issue, which I have never encountered before. Tenant 1. Because of course the namespace already exists. Let's try this. Do request access, vClusters, that does a destroy. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and think about this. If I tear this down, I think that's what I'm gonna have to do. I believe what happened was, for some reason, the onboarding of the vCluster failed. So I'm going to do is I'm going to start over.
It's ephemeral, right?
Exactly. So let's go ahead and show this part a little sooner. Broken. So that's also not being super helpful. Okay, get, wait for, okay. All right, so K delete namespace tenant 1. Let's just give that a second. All right, so I'm blowing away the tenant 1 namespace. We're going to try this again from the top. Were there any other questions while we're waiting for stuff to clean itself up?
I'll say this will be a little bit faster too than just deploying an entire cluster and seeing it fail, and then come back and do it again.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, wrong one. So let's take a look over here, and all the, yeah, we can see that the final pods are going away in the tenant one. Okay, so that's being cleared up. So let's try this again. All right. KLOU.
How many requests would you say are based on wanting to set up something with multi-tenancy versus wanting to set up something that's just faster without using as many clusters, right? Like they just want like speed of being able to deploy something instead of being multi-tenant.
I tend to run into more multi-tenancy than anything else. Oh, it didn't delete the database. This is killing me. All right, hold on a second. You know, I ran this 200 times in the last hour, and of course this time it doesn't work. Kexec ti MySQL. SQL root. Show databases, drop database, vCluster tenant 1, drop user vCluster tenant 1. Okay, let's try that again.
I'm just enjoying that as easy as Kubernetes is supposed to make things, you've now touched many different things to where you're a MySQL database administrator.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so this is the latest one. Let's go ahead and feed that back in, move. And it shows you just how much automation goes into all this stuff. So, okay, so we are back to onboarding our vCluster. Okay, so we're back to onboarding our vCluster. Hopefully that catches us up. Okay, get targets and open unison. Okay, delete target. I want to make sure that that's gone. Open unison. Okay. Hopefully, second, third time's a charm. Yeah, it's weird. For some reason, it got overwritten there. But oh, I bet I know what that problem's gonna. Okay, I'll fix that in a second. So yeah, any questions while we're waiting for our
So say like the skills gap thing too, like what's your background to be able to like manage and fix all this stuff compared to someone who's just really good at writing manifests? That might be something interesting too. Like,
so I kind of came from an application and identity background. So I found that, like, you kind of made the point of all the things you need to know. I found that I had to learn a lot of additional technologies. So like in the identity management world, very little of identity management doesn't involve something else, right? You're managing users in system one, in databases, in directories, in applications. So I had to spend a lot of time learning how to integrate with different things, learning how to know a little bit about a lot of different things. And so once I started working with Kubernetes, I'm not a CKA. I've never had a CKA. I did pass my CKAD several years ago. I've never gotten it renewed. But I've never gone through Kubernetes the hard way. I've always played at that application layer. And so I know a lot about these things to necessarily potentially be dangerous. I do run production systems as well, but a lot of times it's like, and this is pretty typical in most enterprises where, you're not going to run your own database. You're just not, right? You're going to let someone else run that database for you because you're paying people to know how to run that database, right? Enterprises are all about silos, and that's really where we've kind of come into. Here we go. All right, so we're getting somewhere. That's really where we've gotten into this whole issue with all these different systems. So you can see here we're integrating vCluster in the tenant. So if I come back here, let's see. No, okay, we're having the same problem. Sorry, I think I know what this is. So one more thing to fix it. Yeah. So what you know, I've found that in order to learn these different systems, and this is why I think a lot of demos or a lot of approaches tend to be very Kubernetes only focused, is that you have to learn so much to be able to do all these different things. All right, let's try this again. We have to log in again, aren't I? Yes, which is not a big deal. All right, timestamp. I want this one as the latest. Move. There we go. All right. Okay, so now we can see that, ta-da, we've got this vCluster tenant 1 authentication system inside, or authentication mechanism inside of Vault. It's got cluster read access, and it knows how to authenticate tokens coming from our vCluster. We come to policies, vCluster tenant 1, here's the multi-tenant cluster policy that we wrote. Very simplistic, but the idea here is within this policy, within the tenant 1 section of our excuse me, of our vault, any token can read from its own namespace. So that's what got provisioned by Open Unison into vCluster, or into Vault. So if we come over here, let's take a look. I gotta do a quick refresh because I got logged out. And so that's been completed. Yep. So just to take a look, we've onboarded Argo CD. We've generated the token. Everything's now talking to each other. So if we come over here, do a quick refresh on the repositories, we now have a tenant, right? So that got provisioned. And the other thing to point out is that tenant has a deploy key that's already green. That's because we're already talking to, oops, no, sorry. We're already, we've already got an Argo CD that's talking to this repository. So come back here and we'll do a quick refresh. See, now there's this tenant 1. That wasn't there when we first started this day. And we've got a tenant 1 dashboard. And you can see, it might be a little hard to see on the screen share. It actually says the name of the tenant in the tab, so you can have a little easier time tracking. And we've got, if we go to the default namespace, we don't have any pods running, but if we go to our config map, we'll see this initial config map got synced in from our Git repo, which is right here. So, last thing I'm going to show off before we go ahead and show the actual integration, I'm now SSO'd into my Argo tenant. We didn't have to do anything with Okta, right? Everything is SSO integrated into the local tenant. So the last thing, bit of magic we're going to do is let's add a file. And where is it? It's over here. So this is our workload. We'll take a look at it in a second. So here's our deployment, and we're getting all of our information directly out of Vault. Makes this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. So now what's important here is that we're integrating directly with Vault. We're using annotations. We're not storing anything secret inside of our Git implementation. So We're pulling that in, and if we go over to Argo CD, do a quick refresh, we'll see that synchronizing it in. The pod's launching, and if we look at our tenant, boom, there it is, pulling in our information. So we've gone ahead and we've deployed our vCluster. Took a little longer than I had hoped because, live demos. But now another bad thing has happened. We got to rebuild this thing from scratch, right? So I'm going to go into Open Unison, and you can see that we have the ability to destroy this vCluster. So what destroying this vCluster is going to do is it's going to tear down the vCluster, right? So if I go into my tenant, we can see, so this is in the host cluster. We can see everything shutting down, right? All the containers are being shut down. So we're tearing down the vCluster, we're deleting the database, we're deleting all the keys, we're deleting all the linkages. We are not, however, deleting our Git repo. That would be bad, right? Because that's our authoritative source. We go into Vault, we'll see that the hasn't quite gotten torn down yet, or sometimes the GUI doesn't catch up. Let's see here, policies. So we can see the policy is gone. So let me go ahead and just do a quick refresh. And we can see that the policy is gone. So we've now torn down the entire vCluster, but our manifests are all still here. We haven't lost our implementation. And if we take a look at the settings, we'll see that the deploy key that we provisioned is gone. So it's not linked to anything. So now that everything's been torn down, we can recreate the vCluster. So now we've kicked off that process, and this will take a few minutes, but it's now going to recreate all of the ephemeral bits, all of the bits that did not really matter from my as a tenant owner, where I get impacted, right? So if I go to Open Unison, oh, that's why that's not working. Here we go. So we can see that everything's starting to launch again. And this will take another few minutes, but we'll be there. While this is relaunching, any other questions or anything else you'd like to talk about, Mike?
Yeah, it looks like we had a question from Max. So as I understand, vCluster supports development environments and separation of the components of multiple teams of the same organization. So the questions are, do you also recommend using it for production environments? And the second one is, would you recommend using it to onboard each customer organization into a separate cluster within the same host cluster? So we'll do the first one, then I'll reread the second one.
So this is definitely and that's the goal of this demo, right? Is yes, use this for production. Do your own testing, do your own management, but yes, vClusters are absolutely something that you want to start using as production. There are really great use cases for it. There's in addition to the to being able to restage a cluster like this, the ephemeral cluster bit. CRDs, when it comes to multi-tenancy, are a big issue with namespace as a service. Being able to use a vCluster to manage your CRDs, but your your workloads still run your host cluster, that's a big deal. And then being able to more simplify cluster management. With namespace as a service, if I've got a complex application, this is also often very true, especially with monoliths, which I'm seeing more of. It's hard to fit that all in one namespace in an organized way. I think vCluster really helps solve that problem, because now you're not doing you're not doing like these different hacks around like hierarchical namespaces and other kind of things that were thought of for multi-tenancy. vCluster solves a lot of those problems. So I definitely would say that, you know, this was designed for a customer of mine that it's intended to be a production workload. So this is something I definitely get behind for production. As to how you isolate, that's the really cool thing about vCluster is because the pods run on your host implementation. You know, the virtual cluster aspect of it is the API in the database, and the syncer, right? But the actual workload runs on the parent or the host cluster. So what you're really seeing is, you're still relying on that same isolation. So pod security standards or OPA Gatekeeper or Caverno, you can still enforce all those same requirements as if it was on your host cluster. I'm going to do a drop here for vCluster.Pro, because if you use the Pro edition from Loft, it also gives you better user experience because your admins are getting that direct feedback from any of those failures. Excuse me while I sneeze.
And then also you get a GUI, and then you get some other other features too, like for security, like a better or different base image and stuff like that too.
Yeah. So, but yes, the main thrust of everything that you're watching here is that vCluster for dev is great. Like, and that's most of what I've seen from a automation standpoint. I think Adobe has done a lot and talked a lot about how they've automated. You know, I can get a new cluster up and running, mess around with it, and then shut it down very quickly. And like they've got the same thing where it's all GitOps enabled. They hook everything together. This is actually much more focused on those production workloads. We're getting close. We're onboarding Argo CD. Any other questions in the queue?
Nothing yet. Let me check again. I'll say also too for like vCluster.Pro, you've got like an isolated control plane and stuff too, so you can actually connect into different clusters. Like some people using that, like or Atlan and CoreWeave. So like different cool scenarios where like maybe you want to even isolate certain people in a certain cluster, like a physical cluster. You can connect in and you can do all kinds of cool stuff.
Yeah, that is definitely. I haven't had a chance to play around with that aspect yet, but being able to separate out the control plane does seem pretty interesting to me. Yeah, I know the thing that really excites me the most about vCluster.Pro is just the really nice UX of, you know, if my pod and my host fails for some reason, I get that immediate feedback back. That to me is like an easy win. So I think we're done here. And if we come back, we can see that, yes, we have our vCluster tenant inside a vault. We have our policy. We have our deploy key. So if we go to Argo CD, we're able to SSO in, and it's already picked it up. You know, it's been running a few seconds. And our tenant one dashboard is available. So we can see that we've got Argo CD in there, and let's go over to default. Yes, and it's running, and we're picking it up. So we've now done that full circle, right? Like in 45 minutes, I spent about 30 minutes talking, and then, okay, we're a couple minutes over. In about 20 minutes, I had to debug a problem, right? That happens. And we were able to stand up a new vCluster, show it working, destroy the vCluster, and redeploy it and get our workloads up and running immediately out again. So that's that whole life cycle.
We got another question for you too, real quick, if you want.
Sure.
So if using Azure AKS, how does the Azure AD integration with the parent AKS cluster work with vCluster, or is that a problem that Open Unison is solving?
Open Unison solving that problem. So it's completely transparent to the user. And the way that we're doing that is, come back up here. So we being Tremolo Security, forked the Kube OIDC proxy project about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. So we've taken it over, we've kept it up to date, and we embed that into Open Unison. So inside of your vCluster is actually a Kube OIDC proxy. That's how you're accessing your vCluster. So the fact that it's running on AKS, EKS doesn't really matter. It's completely transparent to you as the user.
Awesome.
So a couple links up here, a link to Open Unison. The source from the demo, everything we do is open source. So the source for the demo, if you go to this repo, you're not going to find much in there because I wanted to document it a little bit. I didn't want to just dump it in there, but keep an eye out on that. And then I dropped this in here, Kubernetes Enterprise Guide 3rd edition from GitHub repo. We're in the process of writing it right now. I just finished the vCluster chapter like a week ago. And so all the scripts and everything that we use to build everything up is actually in there. So you can actually go from like an empty Ubuntu VM to a multi-tenant vCluster. It doesn't have Argo and whatnot in there because we haven't covered that part yet. But a lot of what you saw, you can actually get up and running in your own VM pretty quickly. It's all automated. So that's a cool thing to kind of check out. And of course, find me on LinkedIn and your favorite social media, whether it's Twitter, Blue Sky, Mastodon, InfoSec Exchange, all of them, MLBIM.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the demo and the presentation. Like it was great. I'll plug one more thing too. If you want to check out vCluster.Pro and you want to see all the new updates and the new features, head over to vCluster.Pro or vCluster.com/pro. But thanks so much, Marc. Great presentation. It was fun walking through it and talking to you. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks for joining, everyone. Do you have anything else you want to say real quick?
Nope, just thanks for having me.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so much. See you next time.